You may have seen social media blowing up about xylitol and how it increases your risk for heart disease and wondered if it's true. In this podcast, we will dive into the study everybody's talking about, help clarify a few things. So let's get started. Welcome back, team, to the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. Thanks for stopping by. I really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Jordan Rennicke, and I'm a dual board certified physician in family and sports medicine. And the goal of this podcast is to keep you active and healthy for life through actionable, evidence-informed education. And what we're talking about today is a recent article on xylitol and cardiovascular disease. So let's get into it. So let's dive into the study here. And the study is called Xylitol is Prothrombotic and Associated with Cardiovascular Risk. This is by Witkowski et al. And this is published in the European Society of Cardiology, their journal. And a little background on xylitol. Xylitol is a low-calorie sweetener that is like sucrose. And what is it exactly? Well, xylitol is a 5-carbon sugar alcohol that is used as a low-calorie sweetener. So it's used in lots and lots of foods, specifically a lot in low-carb foods. So this is big in the low-carb community. However, it is found in fruit naturally, but in really small quantities. And also you can make it endogenously. So your body can make it, but that's also in very small amounts. The reason we like this so much is because it has similar sweetness to sucrose, which is table sugar. So it's very similar to our table sugar. It can also be used as a bulking sugar substitute that increases shelf life, commonly recommended as a quote unquote natural sweetener in sugar substitutes for patients with diabetes. And it seems to be safe for use with gums, teeth, so frequently used in candy, gum, oral care products. So lots of things and lots of reasons why people want to use this. And why they care about this so much because it's in a lot of different things. And so that's what we're looking at. It is generally regarded as safe by the FDA and the European Union. They kind of look at it, and the reason they think it's safe is because a lot of people use it. They don't seem to have enormous amounts of risks, but this is what we're looking at today specifically. Artificial sweeteners are also recommended for subjects that suffer from cardiovascular disease, things like obesity, all those different things by organizations like the American Heart Association and the Diabetes Association. And so what we're essentially having is these big organizations saying, hey, these artificial sweeteners are safe and good. And now this article here is looking at that to say, hey, is that actually true? And that's what we're diving into. And however, there are some studies indicating that erythritol, which is essentially a cousin to xylitol, may actually cause cardiovascular disease. And the current data on it, like long-term studies are actually pretty rare. There are some links in epidemiologic studies between artificial sweeteners and diseases like insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and heart attacks and strokes. And there have been studies of erythritol, so like I said, the cousin to xylitol, that does seem to have both clinical and mechanistic link to cardiovascular disease. And so the goal of this overall study was to provide human clinical, observational, interventional, and mechanistic studies linking xylitol to cardiovascular disease event risk. So they're saying, hey, is there a way we can look at, and we'll go through the methods here, but interventions that are observational, actually looking at it, looking at people, mechanistic, kind of understanding, hey, the risk for xylitol, is there anything there? Should we be worried or not? And so that's essentially what we're looking at. For a mechanistic study, this is a very technical study. So the caveats here is it's a bit tricky. I'm going to do my best. And I'll be honest, this is not my wheelhouse in terms of I am not a biochemist. I'm not a lab clinical scientist. And so they did a lot of these things that were really, really nitty gritty, which was cool, but it took me a little bit. I'm doing the best I can. So there are a bunch of experiments and they did multiple experiments all in one to kind of come up with almost like a quote unquote summary experiment. And what they did do, they had human, mouse, and mechanistic studies all were done. The human studies, they did do human studies with observational and interventional cohorts. So essentially for these initial observational cohort, what happened was they did some fancy, quote, untargeted metabolomics, where they looked at a bunch of markers in the blood and compared it to MACE outcomes at 3 years. And so taking a step back here, MACE is major adverse cardiovascular events. So things like heart attack, stroke, sometimes they consider heart failure exacerbations as well, but heart attacks and strokes are the big things. And what they did here, they looked at these untargeted metabolomics. So they pretty much found people and they just looked at their blood, did a bunch of sampling of different compounds, and then looked and ran some numbers to say, hey, is there anything here that in these people who had more events, like was there something high? And they found that for xylitol, and they used mass spectrometry to kind of look at levels of these metabolites. And then those people who later in the cohort went on to have elective diagnostic cardiac evaluations, had their bloods checked again and found significant differences between xylitol and those who had those events and those who didn't. So let me step back again and say that. So those people who ended up having workups for heart stuff because they're worried in events, they looked at their blood and said, was there anything there? And they found that overall it looks like xylitol-like components had a higher risk, but they weren't targeted enough. So this is the untargeted metabolomics. So they said, hey, these things are like xylitol, but they're not exactly pure xylitol, but they seemed like those people who had higher levels of that had more cardiovascular issues. And so they said, okay, cool, let's do better. And so what they did next time, they did an interventional cohort where essentially they used targeted metabolomics and they isolated for xylitol and looked at, once again, those people at 3 years. And so the same thing they said, okay, now instead of just And xylitol-like compounds were like, we got xylitol. So they purified it out, made sure they just had xylitol, and those who had xylitol looked at those at 3 years to see what happened. They also did some animal studies looking at mice to test clotting. Essentially what they did, they induced clotting in mice and then they injected either inert substance or xylitol to see how it affected clotting. So once again, we had these animals here and these mice. What they did is they created an injury to the blood vessel. They induced it in some way, shape, or form. And then they're testing the time, like how long did it take to clot? And they injected the mice with xylitol and then also with some inert subject. And they kind of said, hey, looking at the two, is there any difference between the two? They also looked at human blood and did various lab assays to assess clotting there. And overall, this was very extensive and mechanistic. And the baseline characteristics, something I do really want to highlight here, is that these were like very unhealthy cohorts in general, just in terms of they were not healthy, a lot of metabolic disease, lots of cardiometabolic disease and risk factors for that. So not a super healthy population, but that's okay. And so moving on to the results here, it seems like in general, the takeaway here is the higher xylitol levels, the higher the risk of cardiovascular disease in these cohort studies. So once again, in that untargeted group, so that's where we did just the general metabolomics, the highest xylitol group or this T3 group had the most MACE with a hazard ratio of 1.51 after adjustment. And so hazard ratio 1.51 means we're about a 51% increase in MACE. And then they did the targeted ones too, right? Where they just kind of isolated the xylitol out and that seemed to show the same pattern. And I'm going to show right here, you can see this cool chart. It looks fancy with all that stuff. So on the A here is the untargeted metabolomics. So on the video version here, untargeted metabolomics, and on the bottom is the target metabolomics. And we have T1, T2, and T3 in weighting according to, how much xylitol was found in there. And essentially what you'll see here is T1 is the lowest amount of xylitol, whereas T3 are the highest. And you can see both of these T3 are down lowest, meaning this is showing the increased level of MACE. And you can see on the side here, we have, T1, which is kind of right here. That's the baseline. So we set T1, meaning like this is like the standard for this group, this lowest level. They're kind of our standard. How does it compare? And you can see the T3 group on both of them have increased hazard ratios here for MACE. And so what these charts are overall showing is that the higher amount of xylitol in the blood, the higher amount of MACE within that 3-year follow-up. So that's what we're looking at. Kind of cool looking graphs, but interesting. And then in the mice and human blood trials, it seemed like that more xylitol led to more clotting. And the mice, once again, they induced that damage in the blood vessels and then time clotting, and they had faster clotting with xylitol. And then humans showed higher platelet burden with xylitol. And here's an additional image looking at here. On the top, we have the whole blood in human. And as you can see on the top row here, this is xylitol, and on the bottom is the vehicle, just kind of standard. And you can see this light fluorescent green. That is the indication of platelets. And you can see with xylitol at 3 minutes and 2 minutes, we have significantly more platelets, which is indicating they're having an early clotting response, right? And the reason we care about clots is because clots are how we start things like heart attacks and strokes for thrombotic purposes. But that's where we're saying, hey, we're having more clots. And if you go down here to the bottom, we see this is our mouse one. We have the vehicle versus xylitol. So vehicle means, hey, the ones they injected with like some inert substance versus the xylitol. And here they measured, clotting happening at 2, 6, 8 minutes until it's fully occluded. And, take a step back. Yes, they both got fully occluded because that's what we're doing. And we're not talking about the blood vessel being fully occluded. We're talking about creating a thrombin clot, so platelets and then creating essentially stopping bleeding is what we're looking at there. So we do expect that to happen. That was the goal. But you can see that it happened significantly quicker in the xylitol group at 8 minutes, 55 seconds versus 15:30. Just saying that once again, seems like xylitol may be bringing on some sort of pro-inflammatory, pro-thrombotic type environment. That's like the general takeaway there. And then overall, another thing they looked at, well, okay, how much does it actually get into your blood? Like, what are the levels? And they did experiments with consumption of 30 grams of xylitol can lead to, quote unquote, risky levels of blood for hours at a time. And this is another chart here. They did a study looking at what the maybe typical level of xylitol would be after fasting and eating. And the numbers got high enough to be in the, danger zone, like highway to the danger zone. That's what we're looking at here. This chart, overall, you're looking at how high levels of xylitol get, how high do they get after consumption of 30 grams of xylitol. This is looking in the serum, which 30, we'll just take a step back. 30 seems to be a pretty high dose. Like most times in gum, it's like 1 or 2 grams as opposed to this. So this is like eating multiple packs of gum. So we'll talk about that later in the limitations, but just wanted to mention that there. The dotted lines here are kind of like the at-risk zone, which is actually pretty enormous. It's pretty wide-ranging, but you can see it does get way above that for a while, for probably a couple hours, getting above the even quote-unquote danger zone, and then returns down to the baseline by about 24 hours. But they've even found associations in other studies where potentially even at lower levels, we could start having that risk in here. So generally what this is saying is, hey, after consumption of this amount of xylitol, we could expect the xylitol to look like these levels in the blood, just kind of mechanistically understanding, okay, well, what's it like there? And so overall, moving on then to our conclusion as well, it seems like xylitol does exhibit some mechanistic possibility of increasing clotting. That seems to be pretty, what the general data is showing there. These things though are everywhere though, xylitol or artificial sweeteners specifically. In subjects who even didn't eat them, they still found levels of them in their body. So even found positive levels in groundwater. So they're pretty much everywhere. That's why it's important to look at this. There's definitely some mechanistic possibility that this may play a role. Or it could just be that those who had higher xylitol levels had worse outcomes, and it may have nothing to do with the consumption of xylitol. Maybe they just make more naturally or get rid of it less effectively. That's something to consider. But one big limitation here I just want to talk about, there are multiple, but the study is limited by the baseline group characteristics and the dose of xylitol. One thing they didn't actually take was any dietary information on humans. So it wasn't like, hey, the blood that they pulled out, like how much xylitol we're eating in the ones in the observational cohort. It was, hey, we did not look at how much xylitol were they necessarily eating. They just look at what was in their blood. And so we don't know whether it was from their dietary consumption of these xylitol containing products or they just make it endogenously. We're not sure. So we don't know. We cannot link consumption of that to these outcomes necessarily. And like I mentioned before, this group was at a high risk for cardiovascular disease already. So is this generalizable? Someone who's very metabolically healthy, has good blood pressure, good lipids, good insulin sensitivity, all that stuff. If they eat xylitol, is that the same as this group? Who knows? Very different. I would assume not. But once again, I can't say that definitively from this, but they also can't say that, we can't extrapolate to healthy populations. Also, 30-gram dosing was used, which a lot of products are 1 to 2 grams worth. So maybe a bit high. But once again, really cool mechanistically. And as I mentioned before, anytime I do study breakdowns, this is not a rag on the authors. I think that happens a lot on social media. We're just like to nitpick things. I just like to go through the way I think about this, that this is kind of cool, kind of interesting, and definitely making some signal. But overall, the big limitations that I did see though were how much they're using and is it actually related to consumption and the baseline people. But overall, from a takeaway perspective, I still think these are a better choice than sugar sweetened beverages. Call me crazy, but we know the bad that happens from sugar sweetened beverages. And that's not me saying definitively like, oh, sugar's all bad. That's not where I'm coming from. But sugar sweetened beverages are full of calories. And when we consume them, we increase our calorie burden for the day. And over weeks, months, years, that leads to weight gain. And weight gain leads to lots and lots of issues that are a known problem. And that's the biggest thing, right? These are the potential risks of artificial sweeteners. Whereas we know the risks of gaining weight. And so cardiometabolic disease is very closely linked to sugar sweetened beverage consumption. The more you do, the worse it is. So that for me, if someone's like, well, I need something, I need some sort of sugar sweetened something throughout the day, and it's either this or that, I would choose probably artificial sweeteners. I still think that's a better option from a perspective of not increasing weight gain. Now, if you could say, hey, Jordan, I'm going to account for that in my daily macros, I know I won't gain weight, then I don't really care. You can do what you want as long as it's equated for it. But the problem is when you eat ad libitum or whatever you want, we just know that we tend to go more and more. And when people drink calories, we don't seem to make up for that in our body. Let's say you drink 200 calorie can of soda, your body doesn't say, okay, cool, I do that, and so now I'm gonna eat 200 less. No, you eat the same amount of food you normally have, and then plus is 200, and then add that up over months and weeks, and then you have weight gain. So that's for me the big thing is I think if you're gonna replace sugar sweetened beverages, I still think it's a better option, but it does kind of bring up the idea of, okay, should we be avoiding them? In general, I tend to stay away from artificial sweeteners because I'm boring, most boring human being on earth, and I pretty much drink water. But they are in my protein powder, so when I have protein shakes, so that is something I see. I'm not going to avoid them like the plague, but it definitely has me thinking. I think overall make me think about the choices in terms of that I'm going to make, or look at potential other options. As I mentioned, still think they're better than sugar sweetened beverages because we know the havoc they can wreak. But at the end of the day, I don't think this is one where it's definitively this is proven, all done. Obviously, if you want to optimize fully, you're 100% optimizer, then yeah, maybe getting rid of xylitol, erythritol, things like that might be beneficial. But I don't know. I can't say that with any confidence that you're going to ultimately be healthier because this baseline is a little different than probably the people watching this podcast in terms of health consciousness and whatnot. But this is how science is. I love it. We start with this idea like, hey, is this bad for us? Should we be looking into it? And I guarantee this is going to spark more research, which is fantastic. So overall, this does conclude the podcast. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really do appreciate that. And I hope you found today's episode helpful. And if you did, it would mean the world to me if you left a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, or if you shared it with a friend who you think might enjoy it. And if you never want to miss any content, please consider signing up for my mailing list. I'll send you out content whenever I release it during the week, and I promise never to spam you because I hate spam. It's the worst. But that's it for today. Thanks so much. Now get off your phone, go be active. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time.